Hi folks, and welcome to episode 185 of Retro Power Uncut. And we're going to start with the Interceptor again. And Stu's been finishing the exhaust system. He's pretty much done on that now. There's a few little bits left to do. He has finished off the mountings on the rear halves of the main part of the system. He's been finalising the mountings for the heat shielding, and we've been just working out what heat shielding material we were going to use between the exhaust and the fuel tank. I think somebody in the comments actually picked up, were we doing anything about heat shielding the tank? Yes, we are. Pardon me. Yes, we are. And that's in hand. We've just got to order the material for that, which is a double layer crinkled aluminium stuff made by Federal Mogul. That's what we'll be using in there. We've got to finalise the tailpipe lengths, but we want to do that with the car literally sat on the ground, not on the lift, in free space, in free area with the bumpers on, just so that we can sort of see it looking as it will and not in an artificial environment. So that's going to be finalised. And I think that's pretty much... Oh, and Stu's also made the link pipe. Again, I think somebody's picked up in the comments about needing a link pipe. Yes, it does indeed need a link pipe, and we put in a 2-inch link pipe just under the bell housing ahead of the transmission pan. You can still just, Stu's done it so you can just get at the transmission pan bolts, and there's enough clearance to not put too much heat input into everything. We might need to do a bit more heat shielding around there, or we might either ceramic or wrap that pipe. We're not quite decided on exactly what we're going to do in terms of heat shielding on it yet, but that's in place. That's V-band each end. All of the joints on the system are V-bands. The link pipe's V-banded in, and actually we final welded that one this morning so that can be bolted in and make sure that everything's still right there, and then we'll work back through. Probably it'll be early part of next week. We'll pull the system off, back purge it and fully weld it from the front to the back, section at a time, and then refit it and check, because everything moves a little bit from between when it's tacked and the final fit. There's a little bit of movement as the welds pull, so we'll do it a section at a time and then just check the fit's still good and move on that way. So that'll all be fully welded next week. And then Stu's moved on to a couple of things at the back, one of which he was looking forward to and one of which he wasn't. One of them is doing this little infill panel, which sits above the front of the fuel tank and prevents road dirt building up on top of the fuel tank. If Jamie just sort of comes around here and looks into the boot, I can point out in this direction. This is the boot area here. This is the fuel tank made in wood. And the cover that will cover this up will come down here, and this area here will actually be under the car, so road dirt will be able to get on top of the fuel tank there. Not very much, because it's well up above the axle. Not much is going to get in there, but it does want to be shielded really. So we're actually making a panel that sort of basically goes across there like that, which fills that gap in. It's going to have, it'll be sponge sealed to the chassis. It'll have a rubber tailgate seal down onto the top of the tank. And so that will prevent all the dirt getting in there, and then the fuel fittings and etc. Will all be bulkheaded through that panel to access the top of the tank. So it gives us a nice point to bulkhead the fittings to, and it will also mount the fuel filter, as you can see here. Stu's been making the mount for that. So it gives us a handy place to do all the mounting of hardware, and it stops the dirt getting into there. So that's what's going on there. So Stu's onto that. But the other task, the one he wasn't looking forward to, and I've not been looking forward to, is we've had to make a return to the tailgate. We still have a problem with the fit of the tailgate, in that with no stress applied to the tailgate, it fits very well. However, as soon as you fit the opening assistance mechanism, which we had replaced with gas struts, as you'll remember, it fouls up the fit of the tailgate. We reverted to the spring mechanism, thinking that would solve all our problems, even though we didn't really want to use it, and it didn't. It's actually worse, and it really fouls up the fit of the tailgate. So we can only conclude that that is just what happened on Interceptors, and that's why the tailgates don't seem to fit very well on them. However, we're not going to accept that as a solution, that it's not fitting very well. So we're now working through the reasons why it doesn't fit very well and resolving that. One of which seems to be that it's too flexible around where the hinges fit here. Basically, the struts force the the tailgate in such a direction as the whole of the sides basically bend upwards around the edge of these hinges like a wing, and the sides twist up. Our original thought was that they were sort of stretching out, but they can't because of this spot welded section in the middle. But what appears to be happening is it's just gradually curving. It puts a little bit of a curve in that centre section and actually pushes these sort of up. So what we're now looking to do is some revisions here to try and prevent this bending. There's just not enough strength in the tailgate in this area to prevent it bending. So Stu's basically working on that at the moment. The fit's not terrible. You know, I'm not talking about appalling. I've seen a lot worse on most Interceptors. It's just that we like to get the fit better, and it's thwarting progress on that. But Stu's removed the glass again so that he can investigate that, and he's currently working. The worst place seems to be on this side here. The tailgate seems to distort around the side of this hinge. So he's trying to get that straightened out and resolve that issue here. And then we're going to see if we can add a little bit of extra strength around the hinge mounting area and also optimise the geometry of the spring mechanism and the spring tension such that it minimises the load that's put on the tailgate there. So it only just opens it and that it nearly goes over centre at the bottom of its movement so that it's not actually putting any pressure onto the tailgate. It'll mean that you'll have to help it by hand slightly more at the bottom part of its movement. But I don't think that's a major problem, and it means that the forces then are contained within the spring mechanism at its close point and not applied to the tailgate when it's in its closed condition. So that's what we're trying to do there, but it's a bit of a faff, and it's one of those things that's going to take far longer than we'd like it to, just because we can only check it with the tailgate fitted, and you can only really check it properly with the tailgate fitted with the glass in it. Putting the glass in and out is not a 5-minute job, it's a 2-person job that takes a while, and then immediately if you find there's a problem you've got to take it straight back out again. So it's one of those things where, you know, there could be a couple of days work of just to and fro, to and fro, to and fro, to and fro, trying to get that to fit better, but we're just not happy with it at the moment, so that's got to happen. Moving on from that, exciting times. It doesn't look that exciting, granted, but we have, well, I have been up yesterday up to Stockport to see Rick Wood Motorsport. Thoroughly nice chap, and he has given us a dummy engine. And the wise and observant of our projects will be aware that this, despite not looking an awful lot at the moment, is actually loosely a Ford Cosworth GAA engine, which is basically, in the guise as you see it here, is a Ford Essex 3-litre V6 iron engine block with Cosworth GAA head castings attached to it, a ZF bell housing on it, and then some 3D printed intake stacks, and no cam boxes and no cam covers. The cam boxes and cam covers we don't initially need, and will do later on, but we don't initially need them for the initial feeling our way through whether everything's going to fit. The main concern we had was the width across the rear exhaust ports, with the primary pipes coming out of the rear exhaust ports, and the clearance between those and the chassis. More of that in a minute. The secondary to that, which Rick pointed out when I picked it up, is that in period these engines were chiefly were built for the European touring cars, and were built for the Capri RS 3100 touring cars, and as such were in period were raced with mechanical fuel injection and a distributor, and we're getting rid of that, and we're fitting electronic fuel injection and coil on plug. And in order to do that, Rick's CAD man has been doing some work, some design work on the intake stacks so that they can take electronic fuel injectors. However, that's started to raise the height of things. The fuel rail is going to sit about 75 millimetres above these injector bosses here, and our initial look does show that we might have a little bit of a height problem. But more of that in the future, because this is very early stages. This is why we've got a dummy engine and why there's CAD work going on in the background. But Rick's been extremely helpful on this project, and he's a clever chap with a very interesting business around him. Hopefully we might, I do wonder whether we might be able to take a camera up. I'll have to speak to him, but I do wonder about whether we can take a camera up when we go up at a later date to either collect the final engine or to collect some other parts. And hopefully we might be able to go and point a camera around. I don't know, we'll have to talk to him about that. But it's a very interesting place. But yes, Cosworth GAA engine, the spec as it sits at the moment, bear in mind this is an evolving project. The spec as it sits at the moment is that because we don't have to be confined by rules of FIA racing, we can use an aluminium cylinder block. So the current spec is going to be aluminium block, 4 litre capacity. The homologated engine was 3.4 litre. Obviously 24 valve, Cosworth GAA running electronic fuel injection and coil on plug ignition, dry sump, a girdle bottom end construction on the aluminium block, and quite a lot of power. Somewhere between quite a lot and an awful lot of power. 8,000 RPM or thereabouts, maximum RPM. We'll pull the maximum RPM down a little bit. Again, in period, the engines ran to 9,000 RPM. We'll pull that back to around 8,000 RPM in the interest of longevity for a principally road stroke toy car. But even at that, the power levels are going to be in between 400 and 500 horsepower. We don't know exactly where in that range yet. We've not pushed Rick for a number on that. There's no point pushing Rick for a number on it. At the bottom end of that range, it's still going to be immensely fast. At the top end of that range, it's probably going to be too fast. And in any case, it's going to make an incredible noise and carry the kind of original DNA of the Scimitar on with the vehicle. Which is kind of what we wanted to start from. The Scimitar originally had one of these blocks in it, and albeit that it's now going to be an aluminium in large capacity and various other things, at its core is a good old Essex Ford engine, which is kind of the idea with this, is we're keeping that little piece of DNA of the original car, albeit a very tiny piece, I will admit. We just wanted to keep that little piece. And there is a very famous car, as many people have pointed out, the Blue Thunder SE6 Reliance Scimitar hill climb car that was a very well-known car that ran this engine. It no longer does, but years ago did run a Swindon-built Cosworth GAA engine, and again was so well-known and so well-loved in the British motorsport scene. It would be nice to bring another one of these engines back to a Scimitar to get that back in the frame. So that's where we're at with that. I'll allude to a bit of the CAD den side of things at this point. I'm going to pick up a little bit of that actually. I'll leave the rest to the assembly shop side of the video, but briefly, one of the main things we wanted the engine for initially was so we could do a quick scan, to do a quick throw into our chassis in CAD and check that things are likely to be panning out in the right direction. It's looking good. Luke's done a quick scan of this. Got that scan imported and cleaned up in the Peel software, and now got that into CAD. George has then dropped that engine into it's a very rough model at the moment, but the Scimitar body model, which now has the chassis in it, and he's now dropped the engine into that chassis just to check on clearances and positioning, and it's looking pretty good. As I say, we've got a height issue, which is a bit of a concern, but Rick's now aware of that, and Rick's working on other solutions. There are other solutions. That's one of the simpler problems to overcome in the scheme of things. We've got room for our exhausts, we've got room for our cam boxes. In the chassis, we've got to obviously look at the body around that, but we're building that anyway, so that's not too much of a problem. I don't think it's going to get in the way of our steering. Everything else is going to fit. We've still got space for pedals and feet in the footwells. We can still get the exhaust in, so it's all looking good to go, which I was hoping, and my sort of mental calculator and tape measure had said it would all work, but it's another thing actually putting it all together in CAD and making sure it works. So yeah, the CAD guys have done the loose modelling around that, which is what we need to press the go button on the chassis side of things. Now the chassis side of things of this, you'll see develop. We're actually working with another business on this, Ian at Sport Motive up in Stoke-on-Trent, who works on re-chassising TVRs. He builds new TVR chassis to replace Griffith, Chimera, Cerbera, Cigaris chassis that have rusted or been damaged, but he also makes a development of those chassis with revised suspension geometry, which is significantly improved, much nicer wishbones, billet uprights, and just generally takes the best of all the TVR suspension components and then improves them a bit. So he's using the Cigaris type uprights, but then making them in billet rather than cast. And then he's redesigned the wishbones, as I say, for a much nicer geometry, much nicer steering rack with quicker steering, better power assistance, more modern, easily available parts, that's got the correct length for bump steer, etc., etc. I could go on. We will go on in the future, and we'll perhaps take a camera up to see Ian at Sport Motive in a later run cut when we're a bit further down the line, because he's an interesting guy and got some interesting things going on up there. But basically, we are using the crux and core design of a TVR chassis as our new backbone in the Scimitar, instead of the Scimitar ladder chassis. It's basically like a Scimitar ladder chassis, only it's gained some height to add some stiffness to it. And that's how we're working. We're putting the strength still down the centre, just the same as it is on a Scimitar, but we're using the TVR principle where we gain height to gain strength in the chassis. And that's where we're going with that. So the core will be basically a stretched TVR-esque chassis, and Cosworth GA engine and ZF 5-speed gearbox. So the core elements are coming together quite well on that project. I'm getting to this slightly excitable stage, although trying to temper my excitement with, so I usually get overexcited and overlook lots of big design calamities and have to work on them and get all sad about that bit. So I'm going to try and stay, I'm staying cautiously and gradually optimistic, but everything's coming together very well. So yes, last week we were talking about waiting for a part for the Audi. Well, it's here, and that was pretty swift service. This was ordered 2 weeks ago, not even quite 2 weeks ago, I think, from the OEM VW shop, who I believe are in Slovenia. And I cannot rate them highly enough. They have been superb from the point of order to the point of the parts being here. Absolutely superb communication, superbly fast service, extremely good value. This is an Audi part ordered direct from Audi. I can go onto the Audi Tradition web shop and see this part, and I, in theory, could order this part, but Audi will not ship that part to the UK. However, I could go to the OEM VW shop, and I can buy that part from them and have it shipped to the UK more cheaply than Audi, in theory, could do it, even if they would ship to the UK. It's actually cheaper for me to get it from the OEM VW shop. And at the point of order they communicated with me, I expressed I was a bit concerned about the length of the part because it was technically outside of their shipping constraints. They assured me it would be absolutely fine. I mentioned that there would be no problem with paying more for shipping because the shipping was extremely cheap, really. I said there was no problem with paying more for shipping if it needed a more expensive shipping route. They said they didn't think that was a problem. No problem. Lots of communication all the way through. And then the part's here in as I say, I can't remember exactly, but under 2 weeks. So absolutely big thumbs up. I think the OEM VW shop was mentioned by at least one, if not two, of our viewers. Who, quite right now, I had actually found that point. I didn't respond to that because I had actually already found that they listed these parts at the point that those messages were mentioned, but I totally agree. Superb place to deal with. We'll definitely be using them again for Audi parts. Can't rate them highly enough. Absolutely brilliant, considering the distance involved and the usual shipping issues of getting parts into the UK. Absolutely superb, can't fault them, can't rate them highly enough, brilliant people. We have the inner wing, which now means that we can start work on this front corner. At the moment, we're not going to start work right away on this front corner. Other little things that have happened this week on the Audi is that Cal and I have had a bit of a meeting in front of the car, looking at some of the areas of metalwork and how we're going to tackle them, and some of the bits of, some of the changes we're going to be making to the body shell. And basically, I'm not going to elaborate on all of that now. You'll see them as they develop, but we're going to make some fairly significant changes to the rear end and the rear of the boot floor for various reasons. But I'll explain those as they develop rather than trying to explain it all now. Moving on from that, we'll go over to the Allegro. Via guillotine. Pick up quickly. Last week I talked about a terrible nest of wiring on the guillotine, which various people were rightly disgusted by. Between last week and now, I've ordered some parts and put together that which will do all of what we need, basically. That will control the motor, control the power, do the controls for the safety circuits. We've got all the parts for when it gets installed. We've got a safety gate switch for the rear access gate on the machine, e-stop circuit which will control that, warning light to say the controls are on. It's now on 24 volt controls rather than 110 volt controls as it was, even safer, just put it on 24 volt DC controls, then there's no voltage anywhere really on the bits you can touch, which is great. So that will be getting incorporated into the machine at some point in the very near future. So yes, progress being made on that front, which was nice as well. But then onto the Allegro, progress all round on here. We have Bobby and Tom and Matt all working on this. Matt is doing some more lead work at the moment, actually. He's doing some lead work on the back of the bonnet, where we've modified the back of the bonnet to alter the hinge mountings. Matt's tidying up the areas around that and making that all look pretty now, because some of the way that's been done, it could be made to look prettier, should we say. So he's just tidying that up with some lead and making that look a bit nicer on the back of the bonnet. He's also been doing the lead work on the front end of this car, sorting out all the nuances between this car and the other car. So I'm sure Jamie will have some footage, but he's been tidying up the ends of the front valance on this car, getting that to meet with the wings nicely and making all that look correct. Tom has been working on the inner arches. As we mentioned last week, he'd made a start on the angled sections, shaping those to the inners, made a start on the other pieces, but today I've noticed he's been welding up the lips that actually bond onto the quarter panels, getting them shaped up to the quarters, to the final shape, and then getting all of that lot welded together. He's now working on the offside, doing exactly the same again, getting all of the sections shaped up to meet the quarter, so that's all a nice tight fit, so that when it's bonded, the bond gaps are all a sensible gap where that's glued on. Bobby's been working on various sections on the front end, lots of little areas to button up. As an example, the splash shields on the inner wings that shield in between the carbon panel on the outside and the steel inner wing. There are bolt-in splash shields that are going to go in there. And Bobby's been making and welding on the angled sections that are plug welded and spot welded to the body shell that then give us a flange to actually mount those splash shields to, getting those in place. And then at the back, he's been working on getting the battery earth onto the chassis rail, unpicking the pads from the end of the chassis rails, because we've got to redo we've had to take the valance off this car as well. There was some misshaping to the valance as well on this car, so we've had to take this one off to do some reshaping work on it. That meant unpicking the nice mountings that Bobby had made to go between the back of the rails and the valance. So he's taken those off, cleaned them up, got them ready to go back on again once the valance does go back on. He's got all that sorted out. Then he's cut in the recesses for the battery and the amplifier for the stereo. Got those recesses cut in and the captive nuts put in for those, and then at some point, not right this second, those recesses will be made, but they just drop in and then screw into place. So that's a job for a slightly later date, but he's been getting the receivers for those put into place. That's one of the, as an example, that's one of the mountings. It's got to be blasted again now before it goes back in. That's one of the mountings that goes under the chassis rail, plug welds. All of these holes are plug welded to the chassis rail, and then that is one of the rear bumper mountings, and that lot spot welds inside the rear valance. But as I say, he's had to modify that. That goes other side, even. That goes on there. He's had to modify those because of modifying the valance. They didn't quite fit perfectly, so he's been doing a bit of changes on that to make that all fit correctly. And then generally all of the small buttoning up details all over the front end of the car. I can't really list them all. Jamie will have all sorts of little bits of footage of things going on. There's just lots of detail work, bosses, brackets, all of the little bits. I know there've been some toing and froing with Alex in terms of the wiring provisions and a couple of little changes. I know there's a couple of brackets that Bobby's modified because there's been a couple of changes of plan on the wiring front. Nothing major, just small components. I think we're adding a couple of fuses outside of the PDU because of the way the PDU goes to sleep. I think we've had to slightly change the way the power distribution is done and add a circuit that's outside of the PDU that wasn't planned originally. So there's an extra a provision for an extra fuse in there. Beyond, you know, we generally don't use fuses, but there's a couple we have to use because we need a couple of circuits that are outboard of the PDU. And then I think, rather than waffling on, I'm going to say that's about where we're at on that. There's a lot of minor detail work. I'm not going to try and go into it all now because I will get it wrong. But I think probably at this point next week, I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think we'll be pretty much at the point of a final panel up and check of the car, and then early the week after probably be into blasting and zinc metal spraying, I think, all being well, fingers crossed. That's where we're at on Allegro. I'm not going to go off on any more tangents of machinery. I'm then going to gesticulate in the direction of the body shop and say I'm going to hand over to Mark and let him do a quick review and guide you through this week's body shop shenanigans.
All right, everyone. This week, generally just been wet flatting these, polishing them. I've done the doors, the boot lid, the bonnet. I had to redo this door because I went through on the edge here, but mistakes happen. But so I've just got to wet flat this one now, polish this one up, and then panels are done. So like a quick process, if you come over here. My products I use are Freckler. No advertising really, I just like these guys. I like what they use. I use their 360 super fast compound. Cuts really nice. Then we'll finish off with like the DA mop with their like pro stuff, really good. But to start the flatting process, use the DA with the 1500 discs, just to cut it back quickly, get rid of the slight peel. And then we'll go over with the 2000, just a quick cut, but then I will convert back over to the block with the 1500, get it super flat, because I think the DA just makes it a bit wavy, but these, nice hard block, nicely make it flat. And yeah, then 2000, then I'll go over the 2000 with the discs again, just to get rid of like the light scratches, what they did. And then buff up with the Freckler, nice lightweight mop. These are really good. Thank you, Freckler, for providing these, as we used to use the old heavy duty ones, you know, I'm killer through the day. But yeah, so this week I've just been also prepping some parts for the engine bay, the rocker cover for the engine will be body colour. So yeah, that's it this week. Hopefully soon we'll get more footage when the Allegro comes in, wide body one, because Gaz and Steve have been doing some media blackout stuff, top secret, Area 51 stuff. So yeah, we'll be able to show more soon, hopefully. So yeah, Retro Power Mark signing out. See you next week.
Oh, thank you very much, Mark. And at that point, I think it's probably time. I think I've kind of covered everything that's going on in here to a reasonable extent. So I shall hand over to the assembly shop and over to Cal.
Thank you, Nat. And I'm going to start with the Camaro. So a couple of avenues on this. We've been in the build up to the rear window fit for a few weeks now. I think Nat talked about the sort of zinc metal spraying that we do at the metalwork stage around the aperture to avoid corrosion around the little pegs, and we saw Anthony cleaning them up and getting all the clips in place. And then I talked about the high jeopardy job of bonding that in, because I don't want to get bonding agent kind of squodging inwards and being visible when, you know, past where the moulding is there. And interestingly, reading a bit online, because we've never put one of these together before. Obviously, we've dealt with bonded screens a lot, but a lot of people are saying that they use butyl glazing tape to basically stick the back window in, which I can see would avoid the squodging of sealant inboard, because effectively it's just a adhesive strip that you put in there. But I'm not comfortable with. I have used butyl tape in quite a lot of instances before. It's essentially a non-setting rubber strip. That's slightly putty-like, and I really don't feel like it's suitable in this situation, because bonding properly with like a polyurethane-based bonding adhesive actually gives quite a lot of structural strength. And the clincher was, when I was looking at some listings for kind of an off-the-shelf butyl bonding kit, it said the windscreen one had blocks included so that the window didn't slide down if it got hot, which kind of made me think, yeah, if it can do that, then it's definitely not good enough. So I came up with a plan of using this, it's like a 5mm by 5mm square profile foam strip with adhesive tape on the back, and I've basically put that around the aperture lip right inboard on it. The real peril was the fact that the glass doesn't overlap the aperture that far, so I only had a very thin area to get the adhesive outboard of that strip. I've then, because of that, I've put the adhesive on the shell. You're generally doing windscreen fit, you'd put the adhesive on the screen. But I was too worried about that getting messy putting it on, so I've put the adhesive around the outside of the strip. It's a Saint-Gobain primerless adhesive, before anybody points out that I didn't put primer on there first. And yeah, full jeopardy, got the glass in, had a couple of little squash overs where the adhesive came over the foam dam strip on this side, but I was able to scrape them off from the inside. And yes, thankfully, it went extremely well. I just made a point while it was still soft of cleaning all the way around the outside, because the other problem you can have when doing bonded screens, when they've got mouldings like this around the outside, is if you have a lot of squidge out on the sealer and you let that go solid, you can't then fit the mouldings because it literally gets in the way. So I've gone around with just a plastic block, basically cleaning a groove out all around the outside. And that looks really good. I think the only thing I might change is the channel strip we've used to hold the headlining in around the back there. I might try and get a profile that actually comes around and covers and basically butts up to the windscreen, because you can see the actual flange around there at the minute. I'd quite like to improve that. But yes, it's gone quite well. I'm just in the process of fitting these mouldings, which is another avenue of misery. I started this yesterday. I thought I'd come back with renewed patience to try and get these last clips in the side here. As usual, it's coming down to reproduction parts not being amazing. The flange on the edge there originally is kind of like a rounded D shape that clicks into the clip. Or clicks past the clip, should I say. On this one, it's just an inward flange. It doesn't have a sort of return curve to it, which is causing me some problems, but I'm sure we'll get there eventually. And certainly the shape of it all is looking spot on. So I'm reasonably confident. Windscreen next. And then the other thing on this is Richard has been on with, carrying on with the upholstery. So we saw him doing the headlining the other week. He's now done the parcel shelf. He's done this rear section inside here, the corner mouldings, and then he's done the dash and A-pillars. Now they're the first bits on this that have got stitch lines on them, and that was an interesting piece to watch him working on, because often with Alcantara, Alcantara is very thin, and you can get bumps in the back that are really obvious through it. And one of the main issues you tend to find on some people's upholstery jobs is where you've got a seam and you've got the excess on the back of the seam folded back on itself. The fold back material underneath can create a raised ridge, and you can actually see the sides of that, which looks a bit unsightly. So the way Richard's tackled that on this is to basically leave some of the material floating. So he masks first, so the adhesive is literally only under the bit where the fold back on the seam is, and then anything outboard of that doesn't have any adhesive there until the next seam. So you basically have the material between floating, and thus where the sort of step is from the folded back material underneath, the outer layer just literally spans the gap slightly, so you don't end up with that problem of the little step in the material. So that's looking really nice. So that's A-pillars and dash. I've actually got, I think Richard's working on one of the Recaros for the forthcoming Allegro projects. So I'm going to hand over to him to introduce himself and show you what he's up to on that.
Hello, I'm Richard Ulmer. As Gal just introduced me, it's nice to meet all of you guys. It's been really exciting joining the Retro Power team. I'm the in-house trimmer, and yeah, first jobs was to work on the Allegro projects, and I am busy with the Recaro seats that both of those cars will be getting in. This is the Specialist L series from Recaro, a very nice seat. It's got the loose insert in with the leg extension, and then the sliders. We transferred the original sliders from the car to these seats, and they fit beautifully. So basically what we're doing on this project is we're doing a reverse engineering patterning process, as you can see in some of the snips that Jamie will be putting in. And what that means is I basically take off the really nice Recaro cloth seat covers, and I strip them apart with a sharp scalpel blade, and then make copies of them. And then should the customer require, or we feel that it's necessary, we then add some additional styling lines in it to give it like the retro power, a little bit of a twist on it, and just to you know, make it a bit more appealing to us. This specific one is going to get a nice material insert with some leather sides. So yeah, that's where we are with this. So I can't wait to show you guys the final product in a few weeks.
Thank you very much, Richard. And just a quick reminder, I mentioned it last week, we are going to be taking on upholstery jobs for other customers other than on the projects we're working on. So if you're interested in Richard doing some work for you, drop him an email, trim@retropower.co.uk, and we can discuss how we can help do your project upholstery to the next level. On that note, I'm going to move on to project 1. So Alex has been working on this. The bulk of this week actually has been diagnosing and programming the electric power steering unit. Now, as a quick recap on these, a lot of modern cars have electric assist steering, which is actually a sort of motor and steering column unit inside the car which does the assistance. It basically senses when the steering wheel is moving relative to the lower column, and when there is, the more resistance there is, the more the motor assists you. In the early days of people retrofitting that, a lot of people went for early Vauxhall Corsa system because it was very easy to translate into another car. As Corsa B EPS units have generally been eaten up on other projects, people have moved to other ones. And we've moved over on these to a Vauxhall Agila unit, which is really compact, and the splines are quite suitable for retro converting to a fairly standardised lower down link and steering wheel mounting. So we went for on these, I think I've mentioned before actually, we're doing speed dependent assistance. Now that's how they are originally. A lot of people, when they retrofit them, they put just a fairly basic pulse generator controller. So it's just a little box that just generates a pulse to replicate the speed signal, and you can control how much of assistance there is on a knob. But we wanted to do it more like it is originally and actually have it speed dependent. And the Motec ECU obviously has a speed input to it, so we can output speed information to the controller that we're using, which is a little device by Peterson EV, which basically receives the CAN bus message stream from the Motec ECU and then gives the original Vauxhall EPAS controller the information it needs to vary the assistance. However, when we first powered it up, we had no assistance at all, and there was a bit of a complicated diagnosis process in that. Because there were multiple things at play. One of the things we didn't realise is that the unit needs to see more than battery voltage, 13 point something volts, to actually kick in. And we were testing it just on the battery with the car not running. So it took us a little while to work that one out, and that was hampered further by the fact that during our diagnosis we were trying the other unit we've got for Project Kuma, and it turns out that the Vauxhall controller for that unit is actually not working. So in diagnosing using another unit as a reference, we were throwing a proper curveball because that one's actually faulty. Anyway, once we realised that, and we'd realised the battery voltage thing, we could tell that the unit was actually powering up, the Vauxhall unit, but it still wasn't doing any assistance, and that pointed in the direction of the Peterson controller not giving it the signal it needed. And we were then basically going to look into why that was, and that was a twofold thing. Alex is monitoring the CAN data stream, or simulating a CAN data stream to that unit using the ECU Master software, and then using a scope to measure the waveform that it's transmitting to the Vauxhall unit, which is the waveform that replicates the speed data it would normally get in the original Vauxhall application. And there were a couple of things. The main one was that in the CAN data stream, the last byte of information on that data stream is basically a baseline assistance level, and then it varies it from there. And that was transmitting as a 0, which we didn't realise, and that essentially was telling the unit not to provide any speed pulse. So we edited the CAN output from the Motec to fill in that last byte of information, and basically, depending on what number you set that to, it sets the baseline assistance level from which it is then varied according to speed. And then the other thing was that once we had got the waveform being generated, it wasn't a very clean waveform, and what we didn't realise is that the Peterson unit doesn't have internal pull-up resistors in it. Now, to explain a bit more about that, the output signal the input to a digital device needs to be either high, i.e. the battery voltage, or low, which you might call ground. And if it isn't one or the other, if it's not connected, if you like, it just floats in mid-space. There's nothing to make it one or the other. And so in the instance of this, where the pulse generator's pulling down to simulate each pulse, when it's not pulling it down, it's just floating in midair, and you end up with kind of a really vague waveform which doesn't really give the Vauxhall unit the information it needs to interpret that as speed. So what we had to do was put in some pull-up resistors on the feed between the generator and the Vauxhall unit, which then give you a really nice clean square wave. So when it's not pulled down, it's pulled up to battery voltage via this resistor, or up to 5 volts or whatever it might be on this. So you get a nice clean square wave, and that was like the missing piece then. So we got the CAN data stream sorted, so the Motec was telling the Peterson unit everything it needed, and then the pull-up resistors meant that the Peterson unit was giving a nice clean square wave of speed information to the Vauxhall unit, and voila, it's all working. One thing I should mention in all of that is that the unit also only operates, the Vauxhall unit only operates if there is if the engine is running, and the way it knows that is the tacho input. And because we didn't want to be diagnosing it with the engine running all the time, Alex has this little Arduino unit that he's got to basically simulate the engine running. So it fools a crank and cam signal into the system. So we can basically say the engine is running, but without the engine running, which is quite clever. So it definitely helps with the diagnosis. So that's where we're at with that. Over here, this model dinosaur that Jim's been working on is almost there. So we've just been finishing off the hammer form sections for the arches. They were in 2 pieces which have now been bonded together. So they're ready to go on. But one of the last pieces was we need it to really be at a sensible working height. So at the moment we're just fashioning some wooden legs so we can support it up to a decent height. Once that's done, those hammer form arches can slot in, and then the very last piece is gluing it all. So we're using this Gorilla foaming glue, which is great for this sort of thing, because rather than having to disassemble everything, glue all the joins and then squish it together, you basically put it down all the join lines with everything assembled, and the foaming nature of it capillaries into the tight gaps and kind of glues it without the need for disassembling everything. So yeah, we're pretty much on the final stage with this, and that can go over to Andy Hall, Vintage Machines, who's going to do the sheet metal work on this. There's one little check on towards the end of this. The other day I was like, oh God, we better check the boot lid in here. I keep panicking, thinking maybe it's going to come out 1.5 scale or something, even though it quite obviously looks about the right size. But it was quite reassuring. We put the boot lid skin that we'd scanned to design the boot aperture in there, and it's literally a perfect fit. So all looking good on that. Gonna walk over here and you will see a familiar friend back in the workshop. So Land Cruiser is back in for its post-shakedown run. So when we hand these cars over, we kind of get them to the point where we're reasonably happy with how they're performing. But generally speaking, there's going to be some niggles. I mean, of course, manufacturers do thousands and thousands of miles worth of testing. We only tend to do maybe 100-200 miles until we're happy that there's no major issues. So this has now done 500 miles, which is our kind of general bring it back for us to go over it. And what I normally ask the clients to do is just put a list together of any little niggles they've experienced during that time. And then this one, pleasantly small number of issues. The biggest one was a fuel system issue. At one point, he was driving the car, fuel pump got noisy, and then it just cut out, essentially as if it would run out of fuel. But he said, I've only just recently put, I think it was 15 litres of fuel in it, so it didn't really make sense. So I've kind of got that, and actually what happened was they pulled the fuel line off to check if there was fuel at the fuel rail. There was, put it back on, and then it just started. So a bit of a mysterious one. I think it's down to potentially one of 2 things. Either the fuel pickup to the high pressure pump in the main tank is blocked, although I suspect that's not the case. It could have temporarily blocked and then become dislodged again, wherever the blockage might be. I think more likely is something to do with the Venturi pump. So as a recap on this, we've got twin tanks. So the high pressure pump pumps out of the main tank via the fuel rail on the engine, back to the main tank, and then, but on the way it's got a Venturi pump, which is basically just a T-piece with a Venturi in it that sucks fuel out of the secondary tank using the flow of the return fuel and pumps into the primary tank. Essentially, so the secondary tank empties first, and then the primary tank empties second. What I suspect may have happened is that something has obstructed the return to the main tank, and that has then forced the return fuel to redirect into the secondary tank. So it's basically emptied the primary tank into the secondary tank. seems the most likely explanation. So we're going to have a look and see if there's anything obviously obstructing anything in there, but I suspect the answer is going to be a check valve in the return to the secondary tank, so it can only lift out of it and not return into it. So that should be a relatively straightforward one. Generally, you know, it's been absolutely 100%. It literally went into daily use as soon as it was returned. And very positive feedback. A couple of little oversights from us on the pivot bolts on the door hinges I thought were black Xylan finish. It turns out they'd arrived here just as a black natural finish and mistakenly were thought to be already Xylan coated. So we fitted those, and of course they've rusted because that kind of natural black finish just corrodes instantly. So they need to be whipped out. I might just swap them for stainless. And we had the same issue weirdly on the bonnet tie-down latches that we mistakenly thought some natural finish shoulder bolts had already been Xylaned. So I'm going to swap those over. Other than that, it's generally checking over everything on the underside, making sure we're happy with all the nuts, bolts, fasteners are tight. Bit of a road test. I need to do a tweak on the back seat because we didn't isofix points for the client's child seat. But when we tested it, we used a child seat we had lying around, which clipped into place okay. However, his is slightly different in its design and the clips don't quite go into place. So we're going to do some tweaks for that. And then, yeah, hopefully get that back to the owner pronto. So that's that, and then I think I'm going to hand over to Luke to fill you in a little bit on what he's been up to in terms of Quattro interior design. So here's Luke.
Go for it. Hi guys, welcome back to another week in the CAD Cave. This week I've been back on with a lot of Audi stuff. I think at the end of last week I just scanned the door, so since then we've got the scan all cleaned up, brought into CAD, and we've got the entire door now not roughed out. Designed to the point where both the client's happy with it, I'm happy with it, and Cal's also pretty happy with it as well. We showed the client a couple of renders of both the door and the interior. He was generally really happy with it, with a couple of little pointers which we've now changed and implemented as well. So I think he'll be happy with what we've landed with now. Other than that, we have scanned the steering column as well in the car, so I could do the column shroud for that, and that's also looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. And then yeah, just now cracking on to the point where we're kind of looking at how everything is going to be made, looking at the components that are going to go into it. The client really likes these little dials that he has in his RS4, which have a touchscreen function actually on the dial itself. So we found these other ones, which I forget the brand name now, but they're really cool. They have a programmable touchscreen on them, so you can do multiple controls for one knob. And we factored that into the design as well, kind of ticking a couple of different boxes that he wanted to see in there. So I'm liking how that looks. And then yeah, other than that, just looking over the Allegro file at the minute. Those cars are kind of getting to the point now where we have to have all the interior bits for that finalized. We're going to be speaking with Richard, our in-house trimmer, to get his opinion on it, any edits that need to be made to make his life a little bit easier. And then yeah, other than that, I'm having fun.
That's an outtake if ever I saw one. Thank you very much, Luke. And on that note, I think we're going to finish it for this week. We'll catch you again next week. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.